Hi, all of you. Welcome to this Sunday reflection and welcome to the Gospel of the Naked, OiC's series on the Gospel according to St. Mark. My name is Maicon and I'm the pastor at OiC International Church, and I come from Brazil, the land of capybaras. Now, if you think that that's a rather bizarre thing to say, I completely agree with you. I actually find it rather amusing that I have met a fair number of people for no particular reason outside of Brazil who seem to be particularly curious about capybaras. Now, Brazil is a huge country with a very rich and a very varied fauna. So of all the amazing species of animals that we have, I find it quite curious that people would be so enthusiastic about an overgrown rodent. But I guess that's not quite fair. It doesn't quite make it justice because capybaras are actually kind of cute. So let me try it again. A capybara is a rodent, the largest rodent in the world, actually, but not in the way that would give you nightmares. They're actually kind of cute. They're kind of like a huge guinea pig, but then the fur is kind of more like a beaver's, but then it doesn't have the tail, and it barks, kind of like a dog. And then when there's sun, they will gather in groups with their eyes closed towards the sun and just stand there for hours, kind of like Norwegians. So, yeah, it's kind of a peculiar animal when you think about it, and it's definitely hard to describe. Maybe that's why people are so curious about it. So, here, this is what a capybara looks like. The thing is, it's hard to describe something as peculiar as a capybara to people that haven't seen anything of the sort before. And it's even harder to describe something that you have never seen yourself, which is something that I find particularly curious about this story that Mark tells us of Jesus healing a blind man. And this has to be, I think, the weirdest miracle in Jesus' Maicon portfolio. And I want to read it for you. It's in chapter 8 of the Gospel according to St. Mark from verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." So there are two things that I find curious about this story. One is that this man describes people as trees. Being blind, I imagine that he would know very well what a tree was by touch and by smell and would have sort of a mental conception of what a tree is, but he wouldn't have known a tree by the sense of sight. So what makes him describe people as walking trees when he sees them? Perhaps he wasn't born blind. The text doesn't really tell us. Maybe he became blind later in life so that he had a memory of what trees look like. But then there's the other curious thing about this story, and that is that Jesus' miracle seems to not work properly in a way on the first attempt. What's that all about? Was Jesus tired and sort of short on power? Was that man's blindness particularly difficult to heal? None of those explanations really fit at all with how Mark has been talking about Jesus. So what's going on here? Another good question is why Mark would tell this story to begin with. As someone who is writing to argue, his goal is to argue that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, why would he describe this apparent misstep on a miracle? Why not just say that the man was healed and that's that? But maybe Mark's point with the story was not that Jesus could perform miracles and heal a blind man. Those boxes are ticked elsewhere in Mark's gospel multiple times. So Mark doesn't really need another story to make that particular point. Maybe this is about something else. It is noteworthy that Jesus himself asks the man if he can see anything, which again is unusual. The pattern in other stories of miracles is that Jesus makes an affirmation, gets up, come out, stretch your hand, be clean. But here, Jesus makes a question. Do you see anything? So here's the thing. I don't think Mark wants this question to stay within this particular healing account. As we have already found out about Mark several times before, he is knitting stories in an intricate way that makes sense when we step back and look at the bigger literary picture. So let us allow this question, do you see anything? Let us allow this question to stay with us as we continue with Mark towards two other questions that come right away as Mark is telling the story. So he goes on to say, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, who do people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Who do people say I am? And what about you? Who do you say I am? Do you see anything? What do you see? One of the things that we've noticed in the gospel according to Mark is that he is quite unapologetic about the disciples' shortcomings. In fact, he seems keen on emphasizing just how much the disciples struggle to understand what's going on. They don't understand Jesus' parables, and they keep on asking him to explain them. They don't understand Jesus' miracles and keep on underestimating his power and his awareness of them and their needs. They don't understand the way Jesus interprets the law, and they need him to spell it out for them. In the Gospel of Mark, the general rule is the disciples don't get it. So it comes like a relief when Peter finally gets this one right. Who do you say I am? You are the Messiah. Yes, finally, guys. Good job, Peter. That's right. Jesus is the Messiah. I'm glad you see that. Except Peter's Messiah is as blurry as the blind man's walking trees. As soon as Peter declares to Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one of God, as soon as he does that, Jesus starts telling his disciples about what would happen to him. That he would be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus doesn't sugarcoat it. Mark says he spoke plainly about this. And Peter, who just declared that Jesus was the Messiah, calls Jesus aside and rebukes him for predicting his death. Peter is a roller coaster kind of guy. He climbs eagerly to the top and then he drops in a flash. And this is a big drop. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. That's what Jesus tells Peter. And nowhere else in the Bible does Jesus have such strong words of rebuke for his disciples. So what did Peter get wrong this time? Isn't Jesus the Messiah after all? Well, he was indeed, but not the Messiah that Peter at this point saw him to be. It's like Peter was pointing to people and arguing with Jesus that those were, in fact, walking trees. So Jesus has to intervene and help clear the image. You're seeing men like trees, Peter. You need your sight restored so that you can see the man on the tree, the crucified Messiah. The issue isn't that the disciples fail to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, but that they struggle to understand what that means, what a crucified Messiah meant. So Jesus goes about on the work of clearing their understanding of their Messiah and of what it means to follow him. And Mark tells us of Jesus' words from verse 34, when Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." For Peter, this whole death thing seemed un-Christ-like, un-Messiah-like. And now Jesus is telling them that the cross is precisely the way of the Messiah, and not only of the Messiah, but of those who follow him. That seems obvious to us. We have crosses in our churches, and we have associated a cross with Christianity for ages. We often assume that we know what Peter still didn't, that we can see clearly because we know how Easter goes, crucifixion and resurrection. But are we really seeing the one on the tree, the one on the cross, or are we still seeing people like trees? I think it's hard for us to get just how absurd this notion of the Messiah dying on a cross was for Peter and the disciples and everybody else in the first century. A cross, a Roman cross, it wasn't just death. It was humiliation. It was shame. It was a public stripping of someone's dignity and of their very humanity. It was a carefully constructed display of defeat. Those were the things associated with crucifixion. So it's no wonder that the followers of Christ struggled with Jesus telling them to pick up their cross. Nobody wants to do that. And as much as we may know that theoretically, we know these things, but it is difficult for us to really get it because it's very different for us. In Western culture and in Western history, the cross has received several coatings of gold. It has adorned crowns and been the centerpiece of cathedrals. It has been the justification for laws, and it has been the handle of swords. The problem with our use of the notion of taking up our cross is that the cross is no longer a symbol of shame in the same way. We lose the element of absurdity that was inherent to crucifixion in the first century. When Paul argues that he would boast on nothing but Christ and him crucified, he is saying that he will boast on something that cannot be boasted on. If we are to have any similar understanding of this, we need to strip our cross down from its golden casting and its association with worldly power, with our power. But though we struggle to understand with the shame of the cross because of the fame of the cross in our context, still I believe that there might be something that we have in common with these followers of Jesus Christ of the first century. And that is this struggle to take our cross for the sake of the cross of Christ and not for our own sake. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. The problem is in reading this and transforming it into a loop logic that defeats itself. understanding losing our life as just an alternative route for saving it anyway. In other words, we set out to do the exact same thing, save our lives. We just try to find a more holy way to go about it. Ironically, that takes us, of course, back to where we started, trying to save our own lives. But Jesus isn't saying, use the cross. Use the cross. No, he's saying, take up the cross. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means we need to actually consider the cross, to dare to look at it and contemplate the sacrifice of Christ and what it means as we walk daily. And true, the cross was a symbol of death. But the death of Christ on the cross wasn't about death. It was about death being defeated. It was and it is about life. The Christ sacrifice, and so also the Christian sacrifice, is not one that is endeared to death, but it is one that is committed to life. The cross of Christ is not a badge of honor, it is an act of service. Jesus didn't die so that he could raise again to fullness of life, to save his own life, as it were. No, he died so that he could rise again to fullness of life for all. So that he could raise us again to fullness of life. The cross of Christ is one necessarily taken for the sake of another. Before rebuking Peter as strongly as he does, Jesus looks at his disciples. This is in verse 33. And I always found this so meaningful. That look means so much. He looks at his disciples. And then he says, "No, Peter, I will not save my life if that means that their lives, that your life is lost. I will lose it so that you all may live." If the cross of Christ is one necessarily taken for the sake of another, so also the cross that he asks that we carry. It is the cross of grace and love, of sacrifice for the sake of life. And this is why we must forfeit our own life. Our own life must stop being the center and the goal. And we must surrender to the encompassing, abundant life of the risen Christ. A life that, yes, it does include mine in its eternal flourishing, but it is in its abundance that it includes mine and not in its specificity. The cross isn't a transaction to buy our life. It is a surrender to the grace, life force of God. True, taking up our cross is an individual decision. It is we who hang Christ and others on crosses, not God. So taking up our cross must be a free individual decision, but it is not an individual accomplishment, and it is not for an individual end. It is a surrender to life and a struggle to live by the rhythm of God's generous gift of life rather than living or dying by death's greedy grip of death. How do we speak of this? How do we live this and express it? It's hard. It's hard to explain. Even Brazilians may struggle to describe a capybara. And Christians are often describing people like walking trees. But that's not what defines us. It is that we stick close to Jesus. That we constantly ask that He touch our eyes and help us see. That He again touch our hearts and help us love. That He again would shoulder this cross with us so that life can break the dams of death and sorrow that surround us and that are in us. So today again, Christ says, shall we take up the cross and live? May the Lord bless you. May He turn His face towards you and be gracious to you and make His face shine upon you. May this crucified and risen Lord look towards you. And may He give you life, and may He give you peace. Go in peace and serve the Lord joyfully.